November 12, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The first snow of winter drifted across the parade ground, settling on the shoulders of men who had never seen snow before. Prisoners stood in loose formation outside the processing center, their breath forming clouds in the cold air that still felt miraculous after years in the Pacific heat. Beyond the barbed wire, through the skeletal trees of a Wisconsin autumn turning to winter, they could see the town of Sparta, white church steeples, smoke rising from chimneys, children walking home from school with books tucked under their arms. Inside Barracks 7, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto sat on his bunk holding a document he had read 17 times since receiving it 3 days earlier. It was a repatriation order. He was to board a transport ship in 2 weeks, to return to Japan, to go home. The paper trembled in his hands, not from the cold, but from something closer to terror. He did not want to go home. He wanted to stay here, in this prison camp in the middle of America, surrounded by enemies who had become something he could not have imagined. He wanted to stay in the country he had been taught to hate, the country that had shown him a vision of life so different from what he had known that the prospect of returning to Japan felt like a sentence rather than liberation. He was not alone in this feeling. Across the American POW camp system that held approximately 5,400 Japanese prisoners by war's end, a tiny fraction compared to the 371,000 German and Italian prisoners, a significant number expressed reluctance, even refusal, to be repatriated. They begged camp administrators for yanchi. They wrote petitions requesting asylum. They wept at the prospect of returning to the ruins of their homeland. Their captors, their supposed enemies, could not understand it at first. Then, slowly, they began to recognize what they had inadvertently created, a demonstration so powerful that men who had been raised to die for the emperor now chose to remain with those they had been sent to destroy. The Japanese prisoners in Pleaded. American custody represented a unique phenomenon in the Pacific War because their very existence defied the cultural programming that had shaped every aspect of Imperial Japanese military training. Surrender was not merely discouraged, it was considered impossible for a true warrior. The military field code distributed to every Japanese soldier stated explicitly, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner." Soldiers were expected to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than accept capture. This ideology produced casualty rates unprecedented in modern warfare. At Saipan in 1944, of approximately 30,000 Japanese troops, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner, and most of those were unconscious from wounds. At Iwo Jima, only 216 of the 21,000 defenders allowed themselves to be captured. The Japanese military expected a casualty-to-capture ratio of roughly 100 to 1. By comparison, German forces surrendered at rates of 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, typical for Western militaries. The Japanese who did become prisoners represented statistical anomalies, men who had been knocked unconscious and captured before they could resist, who had been isolated and overwhelmed, who had been so severely wounded that they physically could not commit suicide, or in rare cases, who had made the conscious decision that the ideology was false. Takeshi Yamamoto fell into the last category. He had been conscripted in 1943 at age 19 from a farming village in Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's 4 main islands. His family grew rice and vegetables on land they had worked for generations. Life had been difficult. The Depression had struck rural Japan hard, and by the late 1930s, many farming families faced poverty and debt. The military had represented escape, along with the promise of glory and the fulfillment of duty to nation and emperor. Yamamoto had believed what he was taught during training, that Japan was surrounded by enemies seeking to destroy the Yamato race, that expansion into Asia was defensive necessity, that Americans were soft and decadent, incapable of sustaining a long war, certain to negotiate once bloodied sufficiently. He had been shipped to the Philippines in early 1944, assigned to a garrison unit on Leyte, and had spent the next 9 months in deteriorating conditions as American submarines cut supply lines and Allied air supremacy made resupply impossible. By the time American forces invaded Leyte in October 1944, his unit was already weakened by malnutrition and disease. The battle for Leyte lasted from October 1944 through January 1945, one of the largest engagements of the Pacific War. General Hugh MacArthur had returned to the Philippines as promised, and Japanese forces fought with characteristic determination despite being cut off and outnumbered. Yamamoto's unit was pushed into the mountains of the interior, hunted by American infantry and Filipino guerrillas, starving in the jungle. Men died from wounds, from disease, from starvation, from suicide. By December, the unit had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Yamamoto found himself in a group of 17 survivors, moving through the jungle at night, trying to avoid contact, searching for food. They ate leaves, bark, insects. 3 men died from poisonous plants. 2 more committed suicide when their physical condition deteriorated beyond tolerance. On January 8, 1945, the remaining 12 walked into an American patrol. They were too weak to fight, too weak even to run. Yamamoto had made a decision in that moment. He would not kill himself. He would see what happened. It felt like the greatest act of cowardice and the greatest act of courage simultaneously. What happened was nothing like what he expected. The American soldiers did not execute them. They did not torture them for intelligence. They provided water. Immediately, then food, crackers and canned fruit that made several of the prisoners vomit because their stomachs could no longer process rich food. They were transported to a field hospital where medics treated their wounds and infections, where they were deloused and given clean clothes, where they slept on cots under mosquito netting. After a week of medical stabilization, they were moved to a larger holding facility, then eventually shipped to Hawaii, then to the American mainland. Yamamoto arrived at Camp McCoy in March 1945. He expected brutality at every stage. He kept expecting it for months. It never came. Camp McCoy had been established in 1909 as a training facility, expanded dramatically after Pearl Harbor, and by 1944 held multiple prisoner-of-war compounds for German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners, carefully segregated by nationality. The Japanese compound was the smallest, housing fewer than 400 men at its peak. The prisoners were a diverse group, mostly Army conscripts like Yamamoto, but also some naval personnel from sunken ships, a handful of aviators shot down over American territory, even a few civilians who had been classified as enemy aliens. They were kept separate from the German prisoners, partly for security reasons and partly because the psychological profile was so different. The Germans adapted to captivity relatively easily, their military culture recognizing surrender as an acceptable outcome under certain circumstances. The Japanese struggled profoundly with the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. The first shock was the food. Meals at Camp McCoy followed standard Army rations, substantial portions of meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, milk, coffee, fruit. The prisoners ate better than many of them had eaten as soldiers, better than their families in Japan were currently eating. By late 1944, the Japanese home islands were under effective blockade. American submarines had decimated the merchant fleet that brought food imports. Strategic bombing had destroyed transportation infrastructure and disrupted agriculture. Urban. Civilians were rationed at starvation levels. Rural areas fared slightly better, but still faced severe shortages. Letters that reached prisoners, heavily censored and months delayed, described hunger, bombing, desperation. And here, the prisoners ate 3 full meals a day. They gained weight. Their health improved dramatically. Yamamoto had arrived at 93 pounds, skeletal and malarial. Within 3 months, he weighed 130 pounds. His teeth were fixed by American dentists. His malaria was treated with quinine. The disconnect between his situation and that of his family created guilt so intense it felt physical. The second shock was the treatment. Guards at Camp McCoy were professional soldiers, many of them older men who had not been sent to combat zones or younger men recovering from wounds. They enforced camp regulations, but without the brutality that had characterized Japanese military discipline. Prisoners were not beaten for minor infractions. Punishment took the form of restriction to barracks, loss of privileges, extra work duty, consequences proportional to offenses. This measured approach to discipline was foreign to men who had been trained through violence, who had experienced military life as a system of arbitrary cruelty designed to break individual will and forge unit cohesion through shared suffering. At Camp McCoy, when a prisoner violated a rule, he faced predictable consequences. This consistency was itself remarkable. It suggested that the system was based on law rather than the whims of those with power. The third shock, the one that ultimately proved most transformative, was the civilian contact. Camp McCoy was not isolated. It sat near several small Wisconsin towns, Sparta, Tomah, Camp Douglas, and the relationship between the camp and the local communities was complex, but generally functional. Local farmers contracted with the camp to employ prisoner labor in agriculture, particularly during harvest seasons when American farm labor was scarce due to military conscription. Under Geneva Convention rules, prisoners could be employed in non-military work, and by 1944 this practice was widespread across the American POW camp system. German and Italian prisoners worked in agriculture, in food processing, in logging, in various industries facing labor shortages. Japanese prisoners were employed less frequently due to security concerns and deeper racial prejudice, but at camps McCoy and a few other facilities, they too were assigned to agricultural work. Yamamoto first worked outside the camp in June 1945, assigned to a dairy farm owned by the Hoffman family 3 miles from the facility. He and 7 other prisoners were transported each morning by truck, guarded by 2 soldiers, and worked 10-hour days helping with hay harvest. The Hoffmans were third-generation German Americans, their grandparents having immigrated in the 1870s. William Hoffman was 47, too old for conscription, running the farm with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, 2 daughters, aged 14 and 11, and a son, aged 8. The family had been briefed by camp administrators about how to interact with the prisoners, maintain distance, don't fraternize, report any problems immediately. But proximity made distance difficult. The prisoners worked hard, grateful for the opportunity to be outside the camp, to engage in familiar agricultural labor, to feel useful. The Hoffmans noticed this. They noticed also that these supposed savage enemies were polite, careful with equipment, gentle with the animals. The transformation began with small gestures. Margaret Hoffman provided lunch for the work crew, sandwiches, fruit, lemonade. She didn't have to. The prisoners were supposed to bring their own rations. But she saw young men working hard in her fields, and her maternal instinct overrode the he categories of enemy and prisoner. The prisoners ate the food with visible gratitude, bowing in thanks, a gesture the Hoffmans found endearing rather than threatening. The 8-year-old son, Bobby Hoffman, was fascinated by the prisoners. He had been taught at school that the Japanese were cruel, that they had attacked Pearl Harbor treacherously, that they committed atrocities. But the men working in his father's fields didn't seem cruel. They seemed tired and sad when he watched them during lunch breaks, sitting in the shade of the barn eating sandwiches his mother had made. They looked like the farm hands who had worked the property before the war, just younger and foreign. One afternoon in July, Bobby approached the IB2 prisoners during a water break. The guards tensed, but didn't intervene. The boy was clearly not in danger. Bobby held out a baseball, a battered ball he'd been playing with that morning. He made the universal gesture of throwing, demonstrating what he wanted. The prisoners looked at each other, uncertain. Then one of them, a young man who had been a student before conscription, smiled and nodded. He took the ball, threw it back gently. Bobby caught it, laughed, threw it again. Soon several prisoners were playing catch with the American boy, tossing the ball in a circle, teaching him Japanese words for throw and catch, laughing when he mispronounced them. The guards watched, bemused. This was not in any manual, not part of any protocol. But neither was it threatening. It was just people connecting across the vast divide of war and culture through the simple medium of a game. The baseball became a recurring symbol, a bridge between the incomprehensible categories of enemy and human. Bobby returned day after day to play catch with the prisoners during breaks. His older sisters, initially maintaining careful distance, eventually joined. They asked questions through hand gestures and broken English. Where are you from? Do you have siblings? What did you do before the war? The prisoners responded as best they could, their English limited but improving. Yamamoto discovered he had a facility for languages, picking up English phrases quickly. He learned to say farm, cow, harvest, thank you, please, beautiful day. The Hoffman daughters found this charming. They began teaching him more words, bringing picture books, pointing at objects, and providing vocabulary. Their mother watched this with mixed feelings. These were enemies, but they were also boys not much older than her daughters, boys who clearly missed their own families, boys who worked hard and caused no trouble and seemed genuinely grateful for any kindness. The incident that crystallized everything occurred in August 1945, just days after the atomic bombs and the Emperor's surrender announcement. The news reached Camp McCoy through official channels. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The prisoners would eventually be repatriated. The reaction in the Japanese compound was complex. Some prisoners received the news with relief, glad the dying would stop. Others fell into deep depression, the surrender confirming their worst fears about having disgraced themselves by surviving. A few hardliners refused to believe it, insisted it was American propaganda. Yamamoto felt numb. The war was over. He had survived. He would go home to a defeated, occupied, probably destroyed nation. The prospect filled him with dread rather than joy. The day after the announcement, when Yamamoto and his work crew arrived at the Hoffman farm, they found a different atmosphere. The Hoffmans were celebrating. The war was over. Their nephew who served in the Marines would come home. The killing would stop. But they were also aware of the awkwardness, celebrating their victory in front of the defeated. William Hoffman addressed this directly, speaking slowly so the prisoners could understand. He said he was glad the war was over. He said he hoped they would all survive to go home to their families. He said they had been good workers and he bore them no ill will. The simplicity of the statement was powerful. We are not personal enemies. The war made us enemies, and now the war is over. Then Bobby ran up to Yamamoto carrying a notebook and a pencil. He had been learning about the war in school, about the different countries and armies. His teacher had suggested students collect autographs from anyone connected to the war effort, soldiers, factory workers, anyone with a story. Bobby held out the notebook to Yamamoto and made a writing gesture. He wanted an autograph from a Japanese prisoner of war, from the enemy. The boy wanted his signature as a keepsake, as proof of having met someone from the other side of the world, someone who had been part of the great global conflict. Yamamoto stared at the notebook, unable to process what was being asked. The other prisoners watched in amazement. The guards watched with equal confusion, unsure if this was appropriate. And William Hoffman watched his son with a mixture of pride and apprehension, wondering if he should intervene. Then Yamamoto began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then built to full laughter, genuine and uncontrolled. The other prisoners joined. Him, laughing at the absurdity, at the beautiful impossibility of this moment. An American child was asking a Japanese prisoner for his autograph, as if he were someone important, someone worth remembering, someone who mattered. The laughter was not mockery of the boy. It was release, the release of tension, of fear, of the terrible weight of ideology confronting its opposite. They had been taught that Americans were enemies who would show no mercy. Instead, here was a child asking them to sign his notebook, to participate in his school project, to be human beings with stories rather than categories to be destroyed. Yamamoto took the pencil with shaking hands and wrote his name in careful Roman letters, then in Japanese characters. Other prisoners added their signatures. Bobby beamed, thanking them in mangled Japanese he had learned during the summer. The guards looked away, unsure how to classify this interaction in official reports. The Hoffmans watched with tears in their eyes, understanding they were witnessing something rare. The moment when enemies became simply people who had been on opposite sides of a terrible conflict. This scene repeated across the American POW camp system in the months after surrender, with variations but consistent themes. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, German prisoners who had been employed in local timber operations were invited to a community celebration marking the war's end. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, Italian prisoners who had worked on local farms were given farewell parties by the families they had worked for. At multiple camps across the Midwest and South, American children asked prisoners for autographs, for military insignia, for souvenirs from the other side of the world. The prisoners found this treatment incomprehensible, contradicting everything they had been taught about American hatred and vindictiveness. It planted seeds of doubt about all the other things they had been taught, about American weakness, about the superiority of their own systems, about the inevitable triumph of their ideologies. For Japanese prisoners, the cognitive dissonance was especially acute because the gap between expectation and reality was so vast. They had expected execution, torture, enslavement. They had been told Americans were brutal materialists without honor or mercy. Instead, they encountered law, process, proportional punishment, and occasional genuine kindness. They lived in barracks, with heat in winter and mosquito netting in summer. They received medical care that many of them had never had access to as civilians. They ate food their families were starving for. They worked for wages, 80 cents per day paid in camp scrip, which could be spent in the canteen on cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing materials. They played baseball and volleyball. They attended English classes taught by camp administrators. They received mail from home, delayed and censored, but proof that connection still existed. They were treated, in short, as human beings protected by law, rather than as subhuman creatures to be eliminated. The contrast with how Japanese military forces had treated prisoners was impossible to ignore. American POWs in Japanese custody faced systematic brutality that resulted in death rates of approximately 27%, compared to 4% for American POWs in German custody. The Bataan Death March had killed thousands through deprivation, violence, and neglect. Japanese prison camps operated on starvation rations, used forced labor that amounted to slavery, and enforced discipline through torture and execution. Guards had been trained to view prisoners as fundamentally dishonored, unworthy of consideration. The Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but never ratified, was ignored entirely. When Japanese prisoners in American custody learned the details of this treatment, through news reports, through interrogations, through the careful education programs that camp administrators implemented, many experienced shame so profound it restructured their understanding of the war. Their nation had committed atrocities while claiming moral superiority. Their enemy had maintained standards of treatment even when facing an opponent who did not reciprocate. The psychological impact of this realization varied by individual. Some prisoners retreated into denial, insisting the reports were propaganda. Others accepted the facts, but rationalized them as necessary under the circumstances. Still others underwent complete ideological transformation, rejecting the militarism and ultranationalism that had shaped their upbringing. Yamamoto fell into this last category. Over the summer and fall of 1945, working on the Hoffman farm, interacting with American children who saw him as interesting rather than threatening, eating food provided by people who owed him nothing, he felt the structure of his beliefs crumbling. If Americans were not the enemy he had been taught to hate, what else had been false? If his nation had committed atrocities while claiming righteousness, what did that say about the entire system he had served? If surrender had led not to death, but to this strange experience of dignity in captivity, what did that mean about the warrior code that had defined honor as dying rather than accepting? Defeat? The questions tormented him, but they also liberated him. By October 1945, when the repatriation process began to accelerate, Yamamoto had reached a conclusion. He did not want to return to Japan. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The Japan he would return to was defeated, occupied, transformed. His family's farm had probably been damaged or destroyed. His younger brother had died fighting in Burma. His father had been killed in an air raid in 1945. His mother and sister were alive, according to the last letter he received, but living in circumstances he could hardly imagine. What could he offer them? He was a defeated soldier, a prisoner who had surrendered rather than dying, marked by shame in a culture that valued death over dishonor. In Japan, he would be a reminder of failure. Here, in this prison camp in Wisconsin, working on farms, for American families who treated him with distant but genuine respect, he had found something unexpected, a sense that his life might have value beyond dying for a cause. This sentiment was shared by dozens of other Japanese prisoners across the American camp system. In November and December 1945, as repatriation orders were issued and transport ships prepared, a remarkable phenomenon emerged: prisoners requesting to stay. The requests took various forms. Some asked for delays, citing medical conditions or family situations. Others formally petitioned for asylum, arguing that they had renounced militarism and wished to remain in America. A few simply refused to board the ships, forcing camp administrators to decide whether to compel repatriation or allow voluntary remaining. The American authorities were deeply ambivalent. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners after hostilities ended. Immigration laws severely restricted Asian immigration. Public sentiment toward Japanese, inflamed by 4 years of war propaganda, remained hostile. Yet here were enemy prisoners choosing America over their homeland. A propaganda victory, too, significant to ignore entirely. The official policy was repatriation, but with exceptions for special cases. Prisoners who could demonstrate unique value, language skills, technical expertise, intelligence cooperation, might be retained temporarily. Those who could prove political persecution awaited them in occupied Japan might be considered for asylum, but the majority would be sent home, whether they wished it or not. This policy was implemented with varying degrees of rigidity depending on individual camp commanders and the specific circumstances of each prisoner. Some commanders interpreted the rules strictly, allowing no exceptions. Others found creative justifications for delays, recognizing that forced repatriation of willing prisoners created moral complications. At Camp McCoy, the commander was Colonel James Davidson, a career officer who had spent most of the war managing prisoner facilities. Rather than commanding combat troops, he had observed the Japanese prisoners closely, noting their transformation from the traumatized, half-starved scarecrows who arrived to the healthy, increasingly hopeful young men they became. He had read the reports from farmers who employed them universally positive. He had watched children asking for autographs and seen prisoners laughing with genuine joy. When several prisoners, including Yamamoto, submitted formal requests to delay repatriation, Colonel Davidson faced a decision that no regulation clearly addressed. These were enemy combatants whose nations had signed surrender. They should be sent home. But they were also human beings who had committed no crimes beyond fighting for their country, who had been model prisoners, who were making a choice about their own futures. Did America's principles include the right to choose? Colonel Davidson delayed the repatriation of 17 Japanese prisoners from Camp McCoy, citing medical evaluations and administrative processing needs. It was a fig leaf, but it bought time. During that time, several prisoners continued working. Outside the camp, their status ambiguous. Technically still prisoners of war, but practically something closer to paroled workers. Yamamoto continued at the Hoffman farm through the winter of 1945-46, helping with repairs and maintenance, learning American farming methods, improving his English dramatically. The Hoffmans had come to regard him almost as a member of the household, a strange quasi-adoption of a former enemy. Bobby Hoffman, now 9 years old, considered Yamamoto a friend, oblivious to or unconcerned by the complexities of nationality and recent conflict. The boy talked about school, about his plans to raise rabbits, about whether he should play baseball or basketball in the spring. Yamamoto listened and responded in increasingly fluent English, grateful for the normalcy of these conversations, for the symbolic weight of the autograph, the baseball, the simple interactions between American children and Japanese prisoners carried significance far beyond the individual moments. These objects and gestures represented the possibility of seeing, beyond categories, of recognizing shared humanity across the divisions of war. The autograph request said, "You are interesting. You have a story. You matter." The baseball said, "We can play together. We can share joy. The war does not have to define every interaction." The food provided by civilian families said, "You are working hard. You deserve sustenance. We recognize your effort." Each gesture chipped away at the absolute categories: enemy, friend, us, them, civilized, barbaric, that war propaganda required. The prisoners, especially those who chose to stay or tried to stay, were responding to this erosion of categories, to the glimpse of a society where identity was more fluid, where past allegiance did not permanently determine future possibility, where transformation was imaginable. By spring 1946, most Japanese prisoners had been repatriated. The transport ships left from West Coast ports carrying thousands of men back to Japan, to occupied cities, to democratic reforms imposed by American military government, to food shortages and physical reconstruction. The men who returned carried, with them, memories of captivity that contradicted the narrative of American cruelty they had been taught. Some spoke openly about this, sharing stories of decent treatment that influenced family and neighbors. Others remained silent, uncertain. how such stories would be received in a nation grappling with defeat and occupation. But collectively, these thousands of returned prisoners represented a cohort that had seen America from an unusual angle, as defeated enemies treated according to law rather than passion, as workers paid for labor, as human beings whose dignity was acknowledged even in captivity. This cohort became part of the foundation for post-war Japanese understanding of America, contributing to the relatively rapid transformation from enmity to alliance. Takeshi Yamamoto was among the last to be repatriated. Colonel Davidson's delaying tactics bought him nearly 6 months, but eventually, the bureaucratic pressure became irresistible. In April 1946, Yamamoto received final orders to report for transport from San Francisco in May. The Hoffman family held a farewell dinner, a violation of protocols they no longer cared about. They gave him gifts, work clothes, a Bible translated into Japanese, a photograph of their family with him included, standing in front of the barn. Bobby Hoffman cried openly, unable to understand why his friend had to leave. Margaret Hoffman hugged Yamamoto, an intimacy that crossed every social boundary, whispering that he would always be welcome if he ever returned. William Hoffman shook his hand and said that he had been the best farmhand they'd ever employed, that he hoped Yamamoto would find peace in whatever came next. Yamamoto could not speak, could only bow repeatedly, trying to express gratitude that exceeded his English vocabulary. He boarded the transport ship SS Marine Lynx in San Francisco on May 14, 1946, along with nearly 2,000 other repatriated prisoners. The voyage took 18 days, crossing the Pacific in the opposite direction from his journey to war 5 years earlier. He spent most of the voyage on deck, staring at the ocean, thinking about the farm in Wisconsin, about Bobby Hoffman asking for his autograph, about the impossibility of explaining any of this to people in Japan who had not experienced it. The ship docked at Uraga, near Tokyo, on June 1st. The prisoners were processed through repatriation centers, screened for war crimes, given certificates of discharge, and released into occupied Japan with minimal resources or support. Yamamoto made his way to Shikoku, traveling through a landscape of destruction, cities bombed to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, populations displaced. When he reached his village, he found his family's farm had survived relatively intact, but his mother had died in March from malnutrition-related illness. His sister, now married to a man missing an arm from military service, lived in the family house with her husband and infant daughter. The reunion was strained. Yamamoto's sister greeted him with relief, but also with questions he could not answer satisfactorily. Where had he been? What had happened? How had he survived when their brother died, when their father died, when their mother starved? Yamamoto tried to explain about captivity, about the camp in Wisconsin, about the farm work and the American family. His sister listened with incomprehension. He had been a prisoner and had been treated well. He had worked for Americans who fed him and paid him. American children had played with him. None of it made sense within the framework she had for understanding the war. Prisoners were supposed to suffer. Enemies were supposed to hate. The Americans were supposed to be vengeful. Victors? Yet here was her brother, healthy, well-fed, speaking English, describing a captivity that sounded more humane than the conditions their family had endured in Japan during the same period. Yamamoto struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. The occupation, under General MacArthur's administration, was implementing sweeping reforms: land redistribution, democratic constitution, women's suffrage, educational modernization. But daily life remained desperately hard. Food was scarce. Employment was limited. The social fabric had been shredded by defeat, occupation, and the revelations about military atrocities. Yamamoto found work as a translator for American occupation forces, his English language skills valuable. The work brought steady income and access to the PX stores, where goods unavailable to ordinary Japanese could be purchased. But it also marked him as a collaborator in the eyes of some, as someone too comfortable with the occupiers. He endured the criticism, having moved beyond caring about such judgments. He had seen too much, experienced too profound a disconnect between ideology and reality, to return to the certainties that others clung to. In 1952, when the occupation officially ended and Japan regained sovereignty, Yamamoto applied for immigration to the United States. The process was difficult. Immigration quotas for Japanese remained severely restricted, despite the new alliance between the nations. But his language skills, his work with occupation forces, and a letter of recommendation from Colonel Davidson, now retired, eventually secured him a visa. He arrived in California in 1953, worked initially as a farm laborer, then as a translator and cultural liaison for companies beginning to establish trade relations with Japan. In 1957, he visited Wisconsin, traveling to Sparta, knocking on the door of the Hoffman farm, uncertain if they would remember him or welcome him. The family greeted him with tears and embrace. Bobby Hoffman, now 18, was planning to attend college. He showed Yamamoto the autograph book from 1945, the signatures of Japanese prisoners still clearly visible, a relic of childhood that had become a treasure. They spent 2 days catching up, filling in the gaps of 11 years, marveling at the strange path that had led from war to this reunion. Yamamoto eventually settled in California, married a Japanese-American woman whose family had been interned during the war, and worked for decades in agricultural export businesses that facilitated trade between American and Japanese companies. He became a U.S. citizen in 1960, a process that required renouncing allegiance to Japan, a step he took without hesitation, having long since transferred his loyalty to the country that had shown him, during its darkest conflict, a vision of law and decency that transcended the boundaries of friend and enemy. He maintained correspondence with the Hoffman family for the rest of his life, visiting every few years, watching Bobby grow up, marry, have children of his own. The Hoffmans became American family to him, a connection forged in the unlikely circumstances of war and captivity, sustained by mutual respect and affection that outlasted the conflict that had brought them together. The story of Japanese prisoners begging to stay in America, of enemy combatants choosing captivity over repatriation, represents one of the strangest paradoxes of the Pacific War. The recurring symbol of the autograph, of children asking prisoners to sign notebooks, encapsulates the transformation these men experienced. In military cultures built on hierarchy and collective submission, individual identity is subordinated to unit and nation. A signature, a name, becomes almost irrelevant. You are your rank, your function, your obedience. But in American democratic culture, however much it was honored in the breach, there remained an emphasis on individual story, on personal history mattering. When American children asked Japanese prisoners for autographs, they were implicitly saying, "You are an individual with a unique experience. You are someone whose name is worth recording. You exist as a person beyond your role as enemy soldier." For prisoners who had been trained to erase themselves in service to the emperor, this recognition of individuality was revolutionary. It suggested that there were ways of organizing society that did not require the obliteration of self, that strength could come from something other than collective submission. The irony, the tragedy, is that this lesson was taught by a nation that had interned 120,000 of its own Japanese-American citizens, that had conducted war against Japan with a level of racial hatred that often matched Japanese propaganda in reverse. that had incinerated hundreds of thousands of civilians in firebombing campaigns and atomic attacks. American treatment of Japanese prisoners. The relative decency of the POW camp system coexisted with systematic cruelty toward Japanese civilians and with deep racism toward Asian peoples generally. The prisoners who chose to stay were choosing a version of America they had experienced in camps and on farms, often unaware of or willing to overlook the darker aspects of American racial history and wartime conduct. Their choice was based on comparison. Not between ideal systems, but between the militarism they had known and the flawed democracy they had glimpsed. By that comparison, even imperfect America offered something worth choosing. In the decades after the war, a number of former Japanese prisoners who had been held in America wrote memoirs or gave interviews about their experiences. The themes were consistent: shock at humane treatment, cognitive dissonance as propaganda shattered against reality, gradual transformation in understanding of enemy and self, difficulty reintegrating into post-war Japan, lasting impact of interactions with American civilians. These narratives contributed to the broader Japanese reassessment of the war and the militarist period, supporting the pacifist turn in Japanese political culture and the embrace of democracy even as that democracy was imposed by occupation. The prisoners' stories became part of the evidence that another path was possible, that the military ideology that had led Japan to disaster had been fundamentally wrong not just strategically, but morally. Takeshi Yamamoto died in 2003 at age 79, having lived 58 years in America and only 21 in Japan. His funeral was attended by children and grandchildren, by colleagues from his business career, and by representatives of the Hoffman family, Bobby Hoffman, now 66, and his children. They buried him in a California cemetery with a head